Was Jeff Fort a prophet, or was he a predator? Will he ever find the same relief that Larry Hoover found and be able to leave the ADX? This is not just the story of a gang, not just the story of a man. It's the story of America, where poverty meets power, where revolution meets corruption, and where one man stood at the crossroads of salvation and destruction. With Larry Hoover finding relief from the confines of the federal Supermax, will Jeff Fort ever find the same relief? At the age of 78 years old, he still sits inside the concrete mausoleum where he has spent the best years of his life. ADX has been Jeff's life, and he will likely be there until he takes his last breath. Jeff Fort, once known as Prince Malik and later as Abdul Malik Ka'bah, was more than a street boss. He was a prophet to some, a terrorist to others, and a threat to the very fabric of the U.S. government. He was, among others, the imam who would very easily hit you with the Allahu Akbar and dispose of you whether you took your shahada or not. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad abduhu rasulullah. If you crossed the imam, your ass was out. This is the untold story of a boy who rose from the concrete streets of Southside Chicago to become one of the most feared and studied figures in U.S. criminal history. Born February 20th, 1947 in Aberdeen, Mississippi, Jeff Fort moved to Chicago with his mother and siblings during the Great Migration, a mass movement of black families fleeing the Jim Crow South in search of jobs and freedom in the industrialized North. But what Fort found in Chicago was not freedom. What he found was Woodlawn, a community crumbling under poverty, redlining, racial segregation, and abandonment. This was a place of depression, where only the strong would survive, and sometimes even the strong came up empty. Little did the prophet know, he was working his way to the ultimate bit, the rest of his life locked in the federal prison, Supermax. At school, Jeff would struggle. Academics was not his strong point, and he would drop out early. But even as a young teen, his charisma was impossible to ignore, and that charisma would serve him well in life, at least for the small amounts of time he would spend it on the streets. He would command a room. He had presence. He could lead. Jeff had the leadership qualities that would eventually lead him to prison for the rest of his life, and many of those years locked down in the ADX. It's always that way when you're the shot caller. Crime was at his fingertips from a young age, and the desire to be a leader. In 1959, at just 12 years old, seeing an opportunity of being a leader, Fort and his friend Eugene Harrison co-founded a gang they would call the Blackstone Rangers. What began as a street crew of hustling teens would soon evolve into a social force that scared the police, shocked the government, and would seduce the streets. By the mid-1960s, the Blackstone Rangers were one of the largest and most structured street organizations in the U.S. Not a disorganized gang, but a paramilitary force, uniformed, disciplined, with rituals, codes, and a chain of command. They were making a mark, playing games, and leaving no names. If you violated, you would be dealt with. Fort called himself the Supreme Minister. He centralized power, consolidated rival gangs, and created Main 21, a high council of commanders who answered directly to him. In 1967, the Rangers were so influential that they would receive a staggering $1.4 million grant from President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty initiative. Did Jeff trick the government out of their paper? The idea was to redirect gang energy into positive action. The money went toward job training, youth centers, and political activism. Jeff had found a way to get real money. But while Jeff Fort preached uplift by day, he would rule the streets by night. The Rangers were shaking down local businesses, battling rivals, and running a growing heroin trade. The streets belonged to Jeff, at least in his mind. Big U Eugene Henley might have took pages from Jeff's playbook, but with his recent arrest by the feds, he did not foresee the same fate for himself that Jeff is now living. If there was money to get a hold of, then Jeff wanted it, and he wanted in. And if you bucked, you could find yourself by yourself. The press would dub him a black messiah. The FBI called him a national threat. But was Jeff a prophet, or was he a predator? In 1972, Jeff Fort was convicted for misusing federal funds, the very grants meant to uplift his community. Prosecutors alleged Fort used the money to enrich himself and arm his gang. The myth of the community savior soon began to crack. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, but in many ways, prison made him even more dangerous. There were young men there looking for a leader, and Jeff was there to fulfill the need. And in return, as he recruited them, He knew that these young men would do as told, inside and outside the walls. Inside, Fort began to see himself not as a gang leader, but as a spiritual figure. He took his shahada and converted to Islam. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad abduhu rasulullah. He would study African and Middle Eastern politics. He became obsessed with libertarian theology, black nationalism, and revolutionary Islam. Jeff seen more opportunities, and he knew when he hit the bricks this time, bigger things were to come. And those bigger things would only come with power. When he emerged in 1976, he was no longer just Jeff Fort. He was a man on a mission, and he now called himself Prince Malik. Power was what he wanted, and he knew with power came money, and with money came followers. In the early 1980s, the Black Peace Stone Nation underwent a radical transformation. Under Fort's leadership, it rebranded as Al Rukn, Arabic for the pillar. Headquartered in a former theater on 39th and Drexel, dubbed the Fort. The Al Rukn temple looked like a religious sanctuary, but was in reality, according to the feds, a fortified criminal empire. Members wore robes, studied Islam, and pledged loyalty to Fort as their divine leader. He didn't just run a gang, he ran a cult-like theocracy. He gave orders from his throne. He adhered to the Sharia law, according to the Hadith, and implications from the Prophet Muhammad. Some members would face the whip for disobedience. If they violated, they would get lashes, or things could be even worse. Jeff declared that he had received visions from Allah himself. The Al Rukns were the first modern, narco-religious gang in U.S. history. And they were ruthless. Drug trafficking, murder for hire, extortion, witness intimidation, all carried out under the banner of a divine purpose. Victims would be stacked up, and when Jeff told someone to handle business, it was handled. In October 1981, Willie Bibbs, a former Al Rukn member, was murdered because he was believed to be cooperating with law enforcement. Jeff believed Willie was snitching, and there was only one consequence for those that violated the street code and told on their brothers. They had to be silenced, and Willie was put to sleep. According to the feds, Jeff had sent the order out from a prison cell, and Willie would feel the hot lead hit him in the upper body and then the head. In 1984, Jeff Fort began serving a lengthy sentence at the Federal Correctional Institute in Bastrop, Texas. Despite this incarceration, he would remain the leader and mastermind of the Al Rukns. Fort maintained his control over the organization, with extensive telephone conversations from Bastrop to the Chicago headquarters. In order to frustrate federal authorities who were monitoring and recording these conversations, Fort and his chief general, Melvin Mays, developed a complex code for use during these conversations. Even from prison, others would meet the same fate as Willie Bibbs. Power and the want for power can lead people to make choices that could end their lives, especially in the street life. You know what they say, when the cat is away, the mice come out to play. Gary White was another person that would find himself by himself. On a cold Chicago night, Gary would see his breath leave his body in a smoky cloud on 43rd and South Drexel. He would be hit up execution style. His violations? He was an internal rival within the Al Rukns, possibly seeking leadership. Tyrone Grant and Walter Stevens, high-ranking Al Rukns, took the order from Jeff himself and did what they were ordered to do. Like Gary, Raymond Cadillac Smith would also test the power structure and influence that Jeff had. If you tested Jeff, you were a threat, and threats had to be eliminated. Passing messages from prison through visitors and attorneys, Jeff would order the elimination of Cadillac. Although he knew testing Jeff came with the ultimate penalty, he never thought it would be in front of the Al Rukn Fort headquarters, a place that he felt safe. Harry Evans and Eugene Hunter would hit him numerous times. The first shot he felt, the second would end his life, as other meaningless lead would fill his body. There was no reason for the other shots. The second one pierced his heart. And there is where he felt most safe. He would soon meet his fate on that cold April 1985 day, taking his last gulp of that Chicago air before saying goodbye to the world as he knew it. Nothing more, nothing less. This is how it all ended. Harry Evans and Eugene Hunter would eventually testify how they killed Cadillac after getting the order from Jeff. They would help seal the fate of the man they once worshipped. Ending lives were all part of Jeff's life. Whether he was on the street or in a prison cell, his power could reach far. In 1983, the FBI and the ATF launched a full-scale infiltration of the Al Rukns. What they discovered shook the federal government to its core back then. While they were being investigated, Jeff was still trying to work his hand for a big payday. While in prison in Bastrop, Jeff Fort would learn that Louis Farrakhan had received $5 million from the Libyan government. Fort determined that at those wages, the Al Rukns should become employees of the Libyans as well. Fort decided to offer the services of the Al Rukns to the Libyans. According to Fort's plan, the Al Rukns would offer to perform wild activities within the United States in return for $1 million a year from the Libyan government. On March 11, 1986, Al Rukn members Leon McAnderson and Rachel Crenshaw, along with Charles Knox, an unindicted co-conspirator, would travel to Libya to meet with military officials of the Libyan government. At these meetings, Crenshaw and McAnderson presented the Al Rukns' offer. Fort was informed of this meeting, began planning a way to impress the Libyans and to demonstrate the depth of the Al Rukns' commitment to the enterprise. In various conversations that the feds were listening into, Fort, McAnderson, Crenshaw, and others discussed destroying a government building, planting bangers all over the U.S., taking out airplanes, and even killing a Milwaukee alderman or simply committing a killing here and a killing there to get the Libyans' attention. Jeff wanted that money, and there were no limits. Ultimately, Fort decided that it would be more simple to take credit for other people's acts of violence. Thus, a clipping file was established to keep track of a particularly violent but as yet unsolved crimes throughout the United States. The Al Rukns would then send this file to the Libyans and take credit for the mayhem. Fort considered this effort to be lightweight and therefore also decided to make a videotape of Al Rukns pretending to be from various cities around the country to impress the Libyans with the breadth of the Al Rukns membership. Jeff thought he could trick them. Under surveillance, Jeff was caught negotiating with Muammar Gaddafi's Libyan regime, offering to carry out those attacks in the U.S. in exchange for financial support. It was the first time in American history that a domestic street gang was prosecuted or would be prosecuted for conspiring with a foreign government to commit acts that were forbidden in the United States. The feds were getting ready to out-trick Jeff and his people. Special Agent Willie T. Holland and Sam Buford, an informant, would contact Alan Knox, a member of the Al Rukns, and offered to sell him several law rockets and other military supplies. Holland had been in the process of setting up Knox for a cocaine sting, but successfully shifted gears and convinced Knox that he was also able to provide high-tech military weapons, such as the Laurel rocket. The weapon which Holland ultimately provided was inoperative but appeared to contain a live explosive. On July 31, 1986, Knox, under instructions from Fort and Mays, would purchase that rocket for $1,800. Knox, Mays, and Roosevelt and Hawkins, another member of the Al Rukns, met with Buford on that day and exchanged the money for the rocket. Hawkins drove and waited outside with money while the final terms of the deal were completed. Once the purchase was made, Hawkins then drove the rocket home toward the hut, a building owned by the Al Rukns, at 6416 South Kenwood in Chicago. But he would experience car trouble and turn the rocket over to Mays, who transported it the rest of the way. Little did Jeff know, the rest of his life in prison was being sealed at this moment. On August 5th, a search of the hut was conducted pursuant to a warrant. The search uncovered the Law rocket as well as 32 firearms, including a MAC-10 machine gun, a fully automatic .45, and a .45 caliber Commando volunteer carbine, along with several rounds of armor-piercing bullets designed for submachine gun use. The Al Rukns and Jeff Fort were ready to get busy, but the feds were here to slam the door. Jeff's reign from prison or from the streets was over. They would charge Jeff and his people with a 50-count indictment that was sure to put his lights out, and the allegations were brutal and would make sure that he would be put in the confines of the United States' most secure prison. A month-and-a-half-long trial would commence, and Jeff knew he was going to be on the losing end, as the government marched in former friends and loyalties were destroyed. Underlings and subordinates would testify about them being ordered by Jeff to take lives, to commit violence, sell drugs, and other crimes. On November 24, 1987, Jeff would be found guilty in a federal courtroom, along with Leon McAnderson, who would be sentenced to 51 years. His right-hand man, Alan Knox, 54 years. Rico Crenshaw, a 63-piece, and Roosevelt Hawkins, 9 years. Jeff Fort, the prophet or predator, depending on who you rely on, was convicted and sentenced to 80 years in federal prison, plus an additional 75 years for later drug trafficking convictions. But Jeff was not sentenced to life, and he would have a release date of October 14, 2044. The feds, though, they had plans for him. ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, the most secure penitentiary in the country. They needed to control Jeff's power if he had any remaining. They needed to watch his every move and restrict most of them. Life could not be any worse inside this concrete bunker that he had spent many years in. It's a lonely, desolate place. At ADX Florence, Fort is held in extreme isolation, very limited phone access, no physical contact. 23 hours a day in a concrete cell. Visitors are rare. Interviews are forbidden. He exists as a ghost in the machine. Like Larry Hoover said, ADX is a clean version of hell, citing its profound isolation, sensory deprivation, and the psychological toll of living in near total seclusion. Yet even from inside, his name still echoes. In prison yards, in street lore, in hip-hop lyrics, among gang historians. But what does that mean for Jeff? You're just a memory, living in that clean hell, living to die. Who was Jeff Fort really? A revolutionary? A criminal mastermind? A pawn in a broken system? His defenders say he was targeted for uniting black youth and challenging the status quo. His critics say he was a dangerous narcissist who hid behind religion to fuel an empire of violence. He exploited the political system and was then buried by it. He claimed divine revelation, but lived by the gun. His rise mirrored the neglect of a city. His fall mirrored its betrayal. Jeff Fort will likely die behind bars, but the story isn't over. His name still carries weight. His legend is still told. His experiment, merging ideology, crime, and politics, set the template for a new kind of urban insurgency. In a nation where poverty and power continue to collide, where street violence meets state violence, the story of Jeff Fort reminds us that when society abandons its youth, someone will always be waiting to pick them up, for better or for worse. Will Jeff ever find the same fate as Larry Hoover and get clemency, allowing him to lead the concrete bunker, humanity's hell, the Supermax ADX? That will likely never happen under Trump or any other president because of his intentions to strike the U.S. from within. Jeff will likely take his last breath in a prison cell, as his release date is set for 2044, when he would be 98 years old. Thanks for listening to the real story of Jeff Fort, the man who turned a gang into a nation and a nation into his pulpit. Subscribe, share, and join us next week as we explore more truth from the underground.